Welcome everyone to The World at Play. Naomi Clarck and Mary Flanagan on historical game boards. I'm Mathilde Walker-Billo, the creator of programming at the American Folk Art Museum, and thank you for joining us today. A quick note that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. So as many of you know, AFAM is dedicated to the work of self-taught artists across time and place. And we're thrilled to present two new exhibitions, Playing with Design, Gameboards, and Art and Culture, as well as Anything But Simple, Give Drawings, and the Shaker Aesthetic. Now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until January 26, along with the concurrent exhibition Somewhere to Roost. So next slide, please. And you have a view on the exhibition at AFAM. So created by Emily Jevolt with Austin Losada, the exhibition Playing with Design, Game Boards, Art and Culture features over 100 handmade game boards from the exuberant but iconic collection of Bruce and Dorona Wendel. These boards were made from the mid-19th to the early 20th centuries, while massive economic and technological changes accelerated the modernization of America. Crafted locally at home or in artisan shops, these objects reflect the emergence of a new era defined by the expansion of leisure, culture, the excitement of play, and a new appreciation of game design. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by two remarkable game designers and scholars, Mary Flanagan and Naomi Clarck, who will look back at this period in the history of games, using the Wendel Collection as a reference. So in this program, the boards on view offer a springboard to evaluate game design across time and place and decode the political, social, and cultural values that have guided their making. An award-winning game designer and artist, Mary Flanagan is Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor in Digital Humanities and Director of the Tilt Factor Game Research Lab at Dartmouth College. She is the author of Critical Play, Radical Game Design, and Playing Operation, The Legacy of Conquest and Empire in Colonialist Board Games, both published by MIT Press. Naomi Clarck is a game designer who has been making games since 1999, also a game scholar, a critic, and a professor at NYU. She co-authored a game design vocabulary, a textbook that provides a conceptual framework for game analysis and creation. She currently serves as the departmental chair of NYU Game Center, who is partnering with us today for this program. Mary Flanagan will begin this program with a 20-minute presentation on historical games informed by her methodology Critical Play, which investigates and uncovers the ways technologies can adopt and represent hidden ideas within on-screen and physical space. Mary Flanagan will be later joined by Naomi Clarck for a 30-minute conversation, also using the Wendel Collection as a reference. And before I hand it over to Mary, I want to add that there will be time for Q&A after the conversation. So please share your questions for our speakers throughout the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll be using the chat room also for sharing more details about the speakers, their work, the program. And so if you need any information, please drop me a line in the chat. And please know that today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. Don't forget that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We're grateful for opportunities like this program to connect online, which will not be possible without you. I hope you'll consider supporting our program through a donation to the museum. Following this conversation, your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk and self-taught artists. So thank you. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Mary Flanagan. Thank you so much for being with us today. And please take it away.
Great, great. Thank you. I want to just thank the team at the American Folk Art Museum and Mathilde for the idea for this talk and the whole idea for the show, which is really an amazing collection that everyone should definitely see. I wanted to bring a kind of fun romp through the world of play. Historical board games aren't really something that that come to mind for everyone. There are small groups of people doing game research, archaeologists particularly, but looking back on possibly 7,000 or 8,000 years of play, the undocumented board games, we can actually see that games form a kind of an art form onto themselves. They're like music or visual art. Or like singing. They have their own properties, and they also have their own place where they are a very unique art form. So I'm going to definitely talk about analog games. I think we will see in the Q&A some interesting parallels with ways that we talk about digital games as well. So that will be part of our conversation. And I'm very excited that Naomi Clarck and I get to think about these ideas with you all. So how do we consider this big topic of games? You know, humans have played games for thousands of years, and yet the familiar game is somewhat unresearched. There are many reasons for this, right? Like they were considered playthings, they were trivial, they were overlooked, they were used and degraded over time. So maybe they were just thrown out. They were made of temporary materials, or they were games by people whose work wasn't recorded by institutions, for example. And so that's one of the things that we want to start to get together. There is a group called Board Game Studies for those of you who really want to geek out on this. And it's a wonderful community of archaeologists and historians who really look at some of these historical works, like Queen Nefertiti playing a Senet game. Senet's one of these interesting examples of ways in which games survived because they were made out of fancy materials and they were buried with pharaohs. So multiple Senet boards were found in King Tut's tomb, for example. And Senet boards were found in like King Tut was he must have been a great player of the game. So we have these boards and these artifacts because they were preserved, but other games are preserved and they're kind of right in front of us. The family of Mancala, which is called many things, and you'll see some of the names on the screen. It has many names across many parts of the world. It is among the oldest family of games. We actually don't really know what the first games were. We're always learning about our history. This one comes from Kenya and a site that's recently been rediscovered by archaeologists. And it's like in 2024, it's in Archaeology magazine this year. It's a valley full of these Mancala boards, like an ancient arcade. So, and given the erosion of the boards, people were probably playing there for a very long time ago and for a very long time. So the games that are kind of familiar to us have these wonderful cultural references and histories, and that makes them a very special pastime, if you will. Hounds and Jackals is another one. It's also related to this kind of genre of 58 holes. And it was played by both royalty. Here we have the ivory hounds and jackal on the left that was dug up by Howard Carter in 1910 in Thebes. But then we have on the right a recent discovery of an Azerbaijan 58 holes game. So games have been played by rich, poor, privileged, and not. And there are reasons that they became popular. They build trust, they bridge divides, and they can navigate complex communications when possibly languages weren't shared, right? So they're a way that people can have a structured time together. So there's a lot of really interesting things that games do that we kind of take for granted today. One of my favorite cool old games is the Royal Game of Ur, and it's in the British Museum. And it was deeply, deeply researched by Irving Finkel, who found the rules to the game in clay tablets in cuneiform. And because he is a Syrianologist, and so he was able in his copious spare time to literally find the remnants of the rules being discussed between, for example, two brothers, referring to their moves on the board as though they were kind of metaphors, right? So we would probably be able to say something like that if we were using chess metaphors, for example. Recently, I was in Ephesus, which is now in modern day Turkey, with a bunch of archaeologists. This was once home to Greeks and Roman occupations, and it's an entire city. But all throughout the city, in entryways, in stuff in front of like a shop, there are games carved into the rock, and there are different games carved into the rock. So it ends up being a really amazing city of play in a way. There were 5 lines, there were 3 men's Morris, there were 2-player games, there were multiple player games. So it's very interesting to start seeing the role that games have played and bringing people together in everyday life. And you see this in the collection in the show. 9 men's Morris is still being played, and it's still being played in this kind of hand-drawn way, which I really like. I like seeing the stones and people really setting out their game board, but that was also done by folk artists creating their own boards. So it's really amazing to see the connections through time that our folk practices have and have always possibly had. One interesting thing that shows up a lot in the collection are Parcheesi boards. And Parcheesi, for those of you who know a little bit about the history, is actually named after Parcheesi, which is an 18th century game from India, but it could be much, much later. The origins are clouded. There's a similar Mayan game as well that dates back to the 7th century. So there are lots of kind of questions about how games circulate along trade routes and such. But what is known is that by 1572, the Mughal Emperor Akbar played a life-size version of Parcheesi on an outdoor board at his palace in Fatehpur Sikri, India, that can still be seen today, and he dressed slave women in different colored outfits as pieces. So games have political and social connotations, displays of wealth, displays of power, all kinds of things come out when we start to look at games, and that's why they're fascinating. Parcheesi shows up a lot in this, and I when I saw so many of the Parcheesi boards, I was really struck in the collection by how they're so kind of abstract and just beautiful in their design. So many of them have this kind of the beauty and the symmetry and the kind of creation of these patterns to play on. That seems to me to be a real theme in this show. And there's some amazing Parcheesi boards in here. We have this one I'll show you here, which is just a beautiful inlaid wood Parcheesi board, and I'm no American history scholar necessarily, but it screams of Americana to me. It has like a reference possibly to even a railroad and a village. So really looking at games as reflection of culture and cultures of the time is an important thing to do in any game. Also thinking about women's practices and quilting, because you see these patterns coming across, and they're patterns that anyone can do, but you can really do well, and you can polish these existing forms and invent upon these existing forms that look very, very much like Parcheesi boards as well. So Parcheesi coming out of India, we know at least that history. Another interesting game coming out of India is Gayan Chopper, or it's also called Gayan Bazi. And this is a game where it is explicitly designed to teach spiritual liberation. So it's got moral philosophies in the board game, and you can go down and hit one of the snakes and go downward and kind of fall to your graces. What is I'm not exactly sure what that phrase is, but but basically not do so well in the world and fall to evil. Or you can, climb your way up to a spiritual enlightenment. This one is from the Jain religion perspective, but we have them from Muslim and Hindu perspectives as well. So it's amazing to see that different religions kind of took over this form as a contemplative practice and as an educational practice. You can imagine engaging with kids and saying, oh, here's a way to think about, right and wrong and this kind of thing. But it could also be something to meditate on, perhaps, and think about your life's journey. But this is probably looking pretty familiar to you, at least some of you, right? Because this game, of course, is very much related to different versions of what is to become Chutes and Ladders. Chutes and Ladders was very popular, especially in the United States, and Snakes and Ladders being a really popular game, more so in the UK. But really, and I do apologize, I did not give a content warning. There are some offensive images. I tried to avoid most of the offensive images, but it's difficult to do sometimes when you're looking at pictorial representations. So do keep that in mind. The representations are problematic occasionally, and for various reasons. Still are important to study. If you see the snakes and ladders, there are actually little illustrated squares on there talking about virtues and vices. So like you could steal something, or you can be drunk, or you can do a good deed. So climbing up or sliding down is a big part of this moral metaphor, if you will. And I just like looking at the various ways in which this same game has manifest through time as this journey. And that's something I think that Naomi and I will get to, is thinking about the ways in which games have kind of mirrored an educational or a didactic perspective. And looking at some of the game boards historically, I'm going to talk about a genre called the game of the goose. It doesn't look like a goose generally, but I'll discuss why it's called game of the goose. But a lot of the kind of these journeys really are reflected in imagined journeys that are described as moral journeys. This is the Tabula Cevitis, and it's a philosophical. This is an illustration of it, and it's a philosophical allegorical text that talks about the differences between good and evil. And people since the first century were using this as inspiration to think about, drawings and paintings, thinking about the journey of life and the pitfalls and the things that you might fall into. And of course, when we think about some of the other kinds of this really could translate into a kind of game. And in fact, when we look at the genre game of the goose, we see very similar structure, right? It's very similar structure. So almost all games of the goose are race games. Whoever gets to the center wins. Sometimes they have exactly 58 squares. Sometimes they have 64. It can depend. They often have like a well or like a get stuck area. And they also use these geese. When you land on a goose, it gives you a double roll or a double score. So it's a boon. And there's lots of little plays about why the goose itself became this representation of success, but it's based on a text by Rabelais, and it's fairly old. But these games were, we think, the oldest examples that we think we know about are from the 1500s in Italy. And the reason I say that we think we know is because there is no great compendium of all games. There is no book that you can look at and say, these are all the games that have ever been made. It just doesn't exist. There is no IMDb for ancient games. And that would be an interesting thing to discuss when thinking about how you could actually compare these knowledges from around the world that have constructed our leisure time. This game is pretty blank. It's pretty bland, but this genre really ushered in a time because of printing technologies where broadsheets were created and lithographs were used to make games. And there's a really great example of this in 1790. And this is the game of the French Revolution. And the images are very specific. And this is created a year after the French Revolution. And in the little squares, it's showing you all the little things that are important to the French Republic, including like the abolition of extreme religious groups, like the Catholic Church at this time was considered extreme religion. So there are these values built in to the way you're going around and understanding what the revolution means. And these pictorial representations start to have a really important impact in this idea of enculturation, how you're actually kind of instructing or enculturating someone, whether it be children or your neighbors playing some kind of world together, because games are possible worlds. We are enacting them as they go. So making that a dynamic, it has a special power. Games have special power because of that action and agency of the player. We have a game of the goose in this exhibition as well. And you can see that this is a really beautiful example because it also has the snake. So there's goose and snake. There's a really quite well-known prints of the snake game far a long time ago. And this is really kind of, the artist must have seen this and seen something like it anyway, and have modeled this very ornate game based on a peg-based game. So it's almost like a cribbagey kind of experience. So with my time here with you today, the main thing I wanted to talk about is, of course, not to give you an encyclopedic knowledge of all historical games. There's many things I've left out. But looking around the world at the history of game objects and play objects, we do see this real link toward how games reflect the times and the values of the players and the makers. So that's just something to think about if you're a game designer out there, or if you are a game player, to start to unpack some of the ways we have assumptions built into games. And when we get to, we'll talk about some kind of more contemporary games in the conversation, but there are some that really are rich for that situation. This last game example I'm going to show you is the Mansion of Happiness. It was, I believe, originally published in the UK, and then it was published in Salem, Massachusetts. And it also has this kind of track around and has moral values and stuff built in. So the Mansion of Happiness and the Game of Life, there's a Game of Life from this time as well, same kind of format as the Game of the Goose. So one way to think about this is to see, okay, it's a race-based game, but you're actually journeying and like progressing, So there's this kind of sense of an epic quest towards something. And in this case, the Mansion of Happiness means that you've had to land on the good spaces and have been a good person this whole time. So we see remnants of these kinds of ideas in the games we make and we play today. So unpacking them is a very important part of how we can be understanding the art form of games. So I'll just want to end, and before we start the conversation, I just want to say I'm very grateful to be able to speak with you all. If you are interested in board games and colonialism, my collaborator, Mikhail Jakobsen, and I have a book called Playing Oppression, which is about colonialism and historical games. And it is free. It's open access from MIT Press. So that top QR code is that, and then this bottom QR code is just a link to my website, and that is the way I would like to move on to the conversation, because I think we have a lot of things to talk. We're summoning Naomi.
Hello, I've been summoned. Nice to see all of you. And thanks for that amazing talk, Mary. I'm really glad that we got to go on a deep dive with you into the history of board games. Um, but yeah, there's so much to talk about. I think especially the way that these games reflect the cultures in which they were made and how people making those games were able to use them to express their own ideas about I don't know how to live through the realm of play, right?
Right, right. And I one of the things that is a really telling example is something just as basic as dice, right? The representation of dicing or dice playing, it always has this. It appears in Greek vases. It appears in
Right.
all around the world as this really thing that even Plato was like, gaming and gambling is terrible, because
Right.
it's a time waster, and so that link to gambling. By the way, the many of the games of the Goose did instruct players how to gamble. So they were often gambling, which is interesting that they were gambling and instruction based.
Right. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. So the game of the goose, I think of as one of these games that had its origin in kind of a courtly setting, right? So it was a game originally for nobles, much like, like chess was often played at court and kind
Yeah,
of like took its modern form, from like chivalric ideas of romantic love, right? And
yeah,
yeah, and the Game of the Goose similarly, and like also the earliest casinos, like the Ridotto in Venice, were originally like totally off limits to commoners, right? Like it was considered
yeah,
too
yeah,
dangerous, like only for the elites. But then what this slide that we're looking at right now kind of illustrates a real turning point where suddenly more people were able to play games, right? Not only because the materials became more accessible, but because people had actually had free time. They weren't just working in the fields from sun up to sundown, but with the advent of changes in agriculture, especially in England, and then the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, suddenly
hmm
people had time in the evening where they were able to sit around by with light at home with their families and started playing games together, right? And so that seems to have really it was maybe one of the biggest historic turning points for games.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, because the invention of leisure really is this product of the Industrial Revolution, and also, light at home, and meaning that families are together in a different way than they might have been when everyone's doing, tasks everywhere else. If there's a kind of family unit, especially during Victorian times, there were lots of children's activities as well. Like there's a lot of literature about the invention of childhood. And this idea that during Victorian times, like the dolls and all of these kinds of they really became a kind of cult. But yes, I would say that like many of the games, like of the Game of the Goose, I have a really wonderful book from the 1950s that's on print, which documents quite a few of them, and it many of them are like fashion also, or food items, or references from a text. So you're playing along with a particular kind of famous text that's going on. So those are definitely like parlor games.
Right.
I think, then you have this kind of move into the home space, which changes what's played also in a pretty big way.
Right, because just like those toys, just like dolls or other now sort of like mass-produced items for kids, it suddenly became important to ensure that this family time also helps reproduce society and train the next generation in the proper values, right? Which is why I guess we should explain the difference between dice and teetotems, right? Because dice were
Yes.
associated with gambling, and all the way back to, like you were saying, Plato, or earlier, the days of knuckle bones, when they were really made out of sheep and kind of knuckle bones, were associated with the dredges of society, right? The sort of undesirables, who are on the fringes, sailors, criminals, like all sorts of people who you wouldn't want to have those influences in your home. So the teetotum was, I guess, invented, right, as a alternative randomizer, something you could have instead of a die.
Yeah, it was a way that that board game creators could begin to separate the moral world of the game from the moral world of gambling and gaming, as a adult practice. And so yeah, there's these really beautiful teetotems that you can spin, and it's for a while it was very very big, in especially like the 1830s and 40s. And in 1838, one moralist suggested that there were evils posed by games of chance. So good Christians should avoid even spinning a teetotem.
Right. Yeah, because the
Or letting
teetotum,
yeah, go ahead.
it doesn't look like a die, right? And then, I think the Roman numerals on here, instead of the pips from the face of a die, kind of create that visual distance. But before anyone thinking about it, they're like, wait, this is basically just a die. And then you see in the 20th century board game, it's all the plastic spinners that many people grew up with, or the kind of the later form of the teetotum that looks even less like a die. The thing that's really fascinating to me as a game designer is that this is also where suddenly it breaks away from the numbers 1 through 6, right? Like you can see on these teetotems right here, they go all the way up to 10 or 12, or 8.
Oh, I know.
Right?
This is like it's a D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, like role-playing fantasy. Actually very complex die are very old, which is interesting
Right.
too. We kind of think of it as new because many of us grew up with this one kind of die, but in fact there are lots and lots and lots of kinds.
Yeah, yeah, and so these quite well predate the sort of the rediscovery of complex dice in the 70s with Dungeons and Dragons, when like a physics professor was like, oh, what if we use the platonic solids to make all the like funny shaped dice that got popular later? But the teetotems were already there, giving that same kind of range of mathematical possibilities for games. Yeah.
But I love the quote, however, about that chance is somehow, evil.
Yeah.
That a game of chance is posing evils to players. And I think that you see a kind of reaction. And I have a slide here from a color plate from
Right.
a really interesting scripture game here, where you just get pieces of scripture and you're supposed to know them.
Yeah,
Scripture, for those of you who might not know, is a Bible, the Christian Bible. Yes.
And I wonder, do you know whether this game has any element of chance? Like, are you drawing these the pieces on the right, and then
Yes, I think so.
it?
And then you have to try yes, and you're matching. You're matching the A and B targets. Yes, so there's a little bit of I mean, it's not really great, This is a game probably none of us want to play, even if we like scripture. But you see that a lot in older games, like the way that we think about games has matured so quickly and so radically, compared to the way games were imagined even 100 years ago. It's amazing.
Like the fascinating thing for me is that it's at this moment in this kind of like industrial revolution shift that you have people saying, oh, games of chance are evil, will lead you into sin. But also a counter reaction, like this game here, where you have people making games, the sort of early game designers, and including folk designers, who said, wait a second, I like games, I want to make games. Surely there's a way to make them virtuous, right? Which is, I think, is an interesting tension that we have all the way to this day. And then this one, this is my favorite personal piece from the exhibit. And like, I think this really has to be seen in person. So, if you have a chance to go to the American Folk Art Museum, go and check this out. Because I think this is kind of like the third stage where you're saying like, okay, I'm going to pretend that this is a virtuous object, right? But really, it's a collection of games. So if you can't tell from the picture, this object looks kind of like a book, but it's very large. It would be a very large format Bible. And then if you look at it closely, you see the word Bible there, but it says the Sailor's Bible. And if you pull it out, it's not actually a book. It's a fake book that is actually a container, right? Just like, you might have seen in some murder mystery movies or something like that. And the person who made this created compartments. Oops, yeah, like flip back to that. Made compartments for dice, for cards, for chess pieces, for pencils and paper, all sorts of components that you would need to play a variety of games. And then there's a board, on one side of it where you could play a game that's be played on an 8x8 grid, like checkers or chess. So
I think you can play on the other side too. I think it can play on the other
exactly.
side.
Yeah, and so there's this tongue-in-cheek humor here of like, well, what's the Sailor's Bible? It's like having all these pastimes that I can do that have nothing to do with religion. So this tension between, hey, I just want to have fun, and oh, like people think this is evil. Maybe we should make sure there's some moral education in it. This to me really characterizes the state of game design and the things that we deal with making games, like all the way to the present day.
And it's really shocking, isn't it, that the same moral scares and moral debates that kind of keep coming up really have to do, obviously not with the materiality, obviously not with the technology, but actually the space to play is a political act. And I think there's this urge to police it. Because it is a powerful place. So there's this. So yes, I am total agreement with you. I think this is so. I think I should have my own Sailor's Bible.
Yeah, we all should. Somewhere tucked away. I think there's some great comments in chat. Thanks everybody for pointing out that, one of the reasons that maybe this policing started happening from religion was that a lot of early games have a relationship to divination. Like these sort of randomizing devices are ways to sort of that what the early Christian church might have regarded as pagan ways of being able to tell, like, what are the intentions of the gods? Can we sort of like have an oracle that tells us through cards or through tossing bones, what do the gods really want? And of course that sort of had to be stamped out because your priest, your local Catholic priest, is the one who's supposed to tell you, the true answer to that question.
We have these. That is a great observation. Thanks, chat. Because we do have misty origins of Go being rumored to be like a divination tool and things like that. But even now, so it's like, okay, it's either, saucy sailors with, nebulous repute, or it's pagans or people who aren't following a Christian path. So all of this is loaded into something we just take for granted. If you pick up a game of Monopoly, for example, some of these concepts and are kind of baked in to the way we actually create what we call game mechanics and game goals and game notions in that way. But I think we should move on to Monopoly because Monopoly is a special case. And this one is in the exhibition. And I don't have a close-up of it, but it does have some really interesting detail in it. It's clearly a handmade Monopoly. And it has the kind of very similar things. But if you notice, it's late 1930s. So it's this interesting time because Monopoly would have been printed. But it is not, it's like it's a copy. Interestingly, this game started off as a copied game, as a folk practice by a woman, Lizzie McGee, or Maggie, who has multiple patents on this landlord's game starting in 1904, I believe. I think there's a total of 6 patents, actually. and repeatedly had this idea of kind of owning space and going around the board. There's even there's often jail and taxes, but it's really a critique of capitalism by critiquing this economic idea from the George tax system, which is to basically have equal tax on developed and undeveloped land to de-incentivize developers having privilege to build big things all over. So I'll stop there and you can jump in. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I
get carried away with this one.
Oh, I know. I mean, we can talk forever for this. There are at least a couple of great books on this topic where the true origins of Monopoly, right? That you can trace the game back to the landlord's game, and for a very long time, Lizzie Magie was kind of unrecognized as the person who sort of created this new form. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of the landlord's game as being the point at which, or at least one of the very early games that had things like play money, right? Where you have a sort of simulated economy with sort of play currency that wasn't just for doing child's role play, but had a kind of like there's an in-game economy where you're exchanging money, and the win conditions of the game have to do with people having no money or all the money, and then also that she sort of, instead of having a journey like the game of the Goose or Mansion of Happiness, she also sort of had this idea of a cycle, or what we would call a game loop today, where you kind of go around and around, and that's what sort of fuels the income, the kind of like the wage or salary income of the players. So this is like some pretty significant innovations being done by the landlord's game, and then and really at a juncture where going from folk game making and then saying, hey, I have this new idea, I want to get it out there, and patenting it. She had like a little, as I understand it, like a little small business sort of making copies of this and distributing it to help promote the anti-landlord or sort of Georgist ideology. So it kind of is like early steps in the professionalization of game design, but she doesn't quite make it to actually being recognized as the inventor of all this stuff. Instead, it becomes popular in a grassroots way, where we see so many versions of the landlord's game, and then eventually one of them gets snatched up and turned into Monopoly, and that's the point at which somebody really cashes in on it. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, and here's a really great picture from the Anspec archives of the two board games held by Lizzie Magie, which is like amazing. It's interesting because the landlord's game really came out of these like this movement, and some people try to just credit Lizzie Magie as the inventor and say, look, this was just something that everybody invented. But as game designers, we know that games actually don't just emerge. Like somebody sits down and thinks about it. So I think it's an interesting. There may have been multiple kinds of developments, but this game stands out so significantly in its what we call game mechanics, right? And it's for so many different innovations. It's economic system. It's if we compare it to games of the time, it just doesn't. Most games do not have that complexity. And I was doing a tour trying to drive. I was taking a train around Germany trying to find games from this time period that could match the complexity of Monopoly. And I have not found that game yet. But if somebody knows it, please.
Yeah, and in chat, there's a great conversation going on about whether it's possible that Lizzie Magie got some of these ideas that I mentioned from a Native American game that a friend had mentioned. Yeah, which would be really interesting to sort of track down that history. Although it sounds like maybe Lizzie Magie never actually was able to play that game, but just the idea of having resources like play money that were part of the game and having a cycle the influential kind of changed the course of board game design. And it's fascinating to kind of regard that this game sort of became communal property, because it's kind of, you see the power of folk game board making, with the real subject, the exhibition, in all of the varieties of landlords game that got made. And that kind of led to the rise in popularity of Monopoly. Like without that folk activity, I don't think Parker Brothers could have launched a game of this complexity and just said, okay, hey, we're putting out a new game. Instead,
Right,
they
because it would
built
have
on
been
the
so
backs.
unfamiliar. Like
Right,
it would be so unfamiliar compared to the other games that were out at its time. We really just had some whether very almost all track like journey beginning end kinds of track-based games. So it's quite
right.
interesting. You're right. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Um,
I'm was thrilled to see that there is a still the folk activity continued after Parker Brothers commercialized it, right? People were still making their own homebrewed versions of the game, just as they had before Monopoly. It kept going, and the copy of Monopoly in the exhibition, yeah, is from like at least a few years after the commercial version launched, and it has the Atlantic City street names on it, which is how I assume the curators were able to determine like, oh, this is Monopoly, not the landlord's game.
right, exactly. And I just love looking at the materiality of
Yeah,
these kinds of games, and really in person, it's got a whole different. These are objects, right? They're not they're not screens, and they've been touched by lots of hands, and so that is a very interesting part of how we what that if I'm going to go into like Walter Benjamin, the aura of the object thing, whatever. But like, it's interesting to see. They bring their context with them a little bit, right?
right.
There's one last kind of genre, I guess we could talk about that the exhibit brings up that has to do with these notions of enculturation um, and representation a little bit more, and that is these kind of shoot games. They're kind of like shootouts, or these are like physical games where you might be like kind of like cornhole, or like these like physical games, beanbag toss, darts, games where you're kind of projectile sending your projectiles in a physical sense, right? And so there are quite a few in the collection, and they're really really kind of fascinating and also a little troubling, because when you start looking at some of these, and again these some of these images may be difficult. You start to have this idea that like this, remember this, the big joke at this time, remember pie in the face, and all of these like kind of pranks in films and things. So this kind of idea of throwing something and getting the bullseye, but at not an abstract image really, but a kind of representational image of someone. There are several games in the collection, and when I saw this one, I really was taken back to research I was doing in the Bodleian Library, and I came across these really problematic this problematic set of game makers, the Roberts brothers, who these were games specifically made in England, and they're depicting Irish people. So Pat's the boy, they all these people have a shillelagh. They kind of look like um, uh, strange leprechaun people. And the representation that the graphics afford also then start to come into problematic representation, right? And ways in which one is using games in an othering fashion.
Yeah, and certainly there are, researchers into these types of games that have also looked at the history here in this country of like very racist depictions of African Americans used in similar contexts of like something that you would, you would throw a ball at and try to hit in a carnival. Yeah, and I think you can sort of see that motif showing up in the kind of clown-like faces, but they're not entirely devoid of racial representation. I think even the ones that sort of look more like clowns, there's a little bit of this like mockery of an underclass kind of like
Right. And I think
yeah.
and then when you go back to And I've seen different representations, and there are a lot of things I left out of this presentation and talk, and we both did. But one of there have been games like that were about the Holocaust, where you play as someone who is sending Jewish people out of a town. There are games that were commercially published like that. And that is something that kind of getting to reckon with that history is a really important thing for people interested in games, because our playthings are never innocent, and we think they are, and there's this tension about that we are constantly negotiating.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of an understandable desire to imagine, like you're saying, the production of the idea of childhood comes with it, this idea of like, oh, well, we were in the state of innocence and everything was fine back then. And then we grew up and we realized like how difficult and terrible the world is. But we want to project back on our toys and playthings or the video games that we played as kids like that, like, no, surely that was all innocent. Don't ruin my childhood for me, by telling me what horrible scandal that children's show star was involved in or whatever, right? And I think, there's something very similar goes on with games. Even, I guess what I would consider the descendants of this type of game, like first-person shooters, right, are such a politically controversial kind of game, not only because they're blamed for violence and shooting deaths here in the United States, but also because they frequently do address political topics because they're about war or insurrection. And the huge companies that make today's, shooting, target hitting games go to great lengths to insist that they are not making anything political, right? They're like, oh, no. These are just pure works of entertainment. Any resemblance that our game may bear to the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., that's totally coincidental. This is like a real case of some games, right? So, I think of this as another move in this whole tension between video games and morality, right? Like, well, you can try to make a game and say, oh, look, we put moral education into our game. And that's how we address this issue. Or you can kind of thumb your nose at it, like the Sailor's Bible. And, that's obviously a sort of popular thing to do. It'd be like, yeah, we are the undesirables, like, oh, who cares, man?
Yeah.
Or if you're a big
that would be Rockstar games. That would be Rockstar.
That'd be like Rockstar games. Grand Theft Auto definitely has that style, right? They're a little bit of the Sailor's Bible of today. And the whole like games for change, social impact game movement are the kind of like, moral educators through games of today. And then the third category is people who are like, oh, no, there's nothing going on here at all. This is not like there's no morality of any kind here. Please leave us out of this whole thing, right? Which seems to
look
be the
away.
Yeah, just look somewhere else. This is purely fictional, and that seems to be the most popular attitude right now for large companies, right? And I think you see all three of these currents throughout the history of games. So they're part of the story of the fraught nature of games in society.
Yeah, so I think we are getting to a point where we almost can start with some questions and some more dialogue. And we do want to just plug the exhibition and this and the works collected. It's an amazing collection, and congrats to just look at how colorful and handcrafted. All the people's stories behind all of these games is just an amazing. A valuable resource.
Thank you so much, Mary and Naomi, for this conversation. Also for just looking at the collection with a fresh and critical eye. So it was really illuminating. I'd like.
Should I stop sharing?
Yes, maybe yes.
Should we have faces? More faces.
That sounds good. And yeah, so maybe I would like to encourage everyone here on the call to share questions. I'll kick off the Q&A with my own question for you both as game scholars and also historians. If you'd like to share your experience visiting collections or exhibition of games, and if there is one exhibition or one collection in particular that really informed, if not transformed, your interaction and understanding of the culture of games?
Yeah, you've been doing some research in this recently, right, Mary?
I was in the chat. I'm sorry. I have to have that question repeated.
Do you want me to repeat the question?
I shouldn't have opened the chat. Yes, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, there's as much enthusiasm on the screen than on the chat.
I know there's a lot of good stuff in there. A lot of people we know.
Yes. But
Okay,
yes,
can you repeat the question?
Yes, I'm not sure you heard my question, Mary, but I just wanted to have you as a game scholar, historian, researcher, if you have any collections or exhibition that really inform the way you interact and approach games. And I'm sure Naomi also may have some in this.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll start and then just I definitely actually with Celia Pierce, who I think is around. She and I went to the New York Historical Society long ago, and we're looking at their collection there, and we started documenting their games. And then I guess I just have that bug to go to archives and look at games. And so my more recent push into this direction was I was a museum scholar at the Getty. And I was in the special collections of the Getty, and lo and behold, they had the game of the French Revolution and stuff like that. And they also had like paper dolls and interesting things with colonialist themes. So people are collecting this material, but it's really hard to find where to go. But many museums and archives, you can make research appointments or get a group together and check stuff out. The Bodleian's collection is very impressive as well, but also just Germany, because like there's so many weird little game museums in Germany, and like in Chemnitz, you like or wherever, like you just go around and there's a lot of game material. And the last thing I'll say is the board game studies group is really a small but potent collection of knowledge that is really invaluable. I don't know what we would know without them, actually.
Yeah, I mean, Mary, you mentioned so many excellent ones. I also think I feel really grateful that that curators and archivists have been preserving board games in a way that I don't think would have happened, 20, 25 years ago. And that some of these things have been in collections for a really long time, but now they're being shown more to the public. The JP Morgan Library, another one that has a bunch of old games if you're in New York City. And
the Strong.
I was about to say the Strong Museum is kind of like famous among game designers and scholars as like having such a huge collection of both of digital games, I think especially, but also not. They also have non-digital games in that collection, so it's just enormous. So I'd absolutely recommend that. As far as like particular exhibitions, I think I'm gonna flip it and say that the exhibitions recently, in the last, I guess maybe it's only like 6 or 7 years, that have started curating together shows of like living game makers, I think are really important to create this continuity between the not just like, oh, there were these people making games in the past, and there are sort of interesting examples of like what happens decades ago, but also the people doing things currently. So I think a huge one for that was the Design Play Disrupt exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which I think happened in 2018, curated by Marie Fulston. And she was sort of really, I think that was the first time that I saw an exhibition where they were really looking at the creative process of game making and assembling lots of materials around like how the games being shown were made, like what context they were made in, like really treating them as art objects rather than consumer objects, which I think is how so often modern games, especially video games, are viewed.
Impressive. That's a great series of and yes, references for the game enthusiast. Another question I have, because the curator of the exhibition, Amy J. Volt, mentioned that there is a lack of scholarship in the study of unpainted game boards, and so I was wondering if you can talk about this lag, but also if you can talk more about the challenges of studying painted game boards or handmade game board, if there is any particular challenges in the study of those items.
I just think board games have just been understudied because they've not been taken seriously. Like they're seen as it's just not, hasn't been very the scholarship is happening now, except for some of the very historic things, right? So the hand painted generation, there might be an article or two, but it's really not it's not really focused on, and it should be discussed, the role of women in those hand-painted board games, because of course women were highly involved in the creation of hand-painted lithographic printed board games, and that kind of history is not really well known either. So I just don't. I think because game studies as a field is relatively young, I think that we're starting to see some of that scholarship now. And maybe in American studies, we have like some, for example, some material culture studies. Yeah.
And Matilda, were you asking specifically about like unpainted versus painted board games?
Yes, exactly. Commercially made versus handmade and painted. I mean, that's one of the observations the curator who said that studying these selections from the Wendel collection, which are all unmade, realizing that there's really little scholarship on the particular items. So I was just wondering if there's more to know about that lack around those objects. Yeah.
One interesting thing to say about that, which is that it can often be difficult to figure out how handmade board games were played, because they were often part of, maybe a very, very local tradition, maybe even just like one household, or even just like two people. It could be like representing like a very small play tradition. Because house rules, like a lot of people know that term, right? It just refers to like how we were playing it. And a handmade board could actually reflect like a very local variant of a game. But what tends to, as I understand it, survive less often are any record of the rules by which people played. Because actually writing down rules as opposed to transmitting them orally is the surprisingly difficult design challenge to actually encode things in a form that's reliable to play with, rather than kind of passing it on as an oral tradition. So I think there's often a lot of guesswork with handmade games, and I experienced this when sort of looking at artifacts in the collection, of trying to figure out like, okay, what tradition was this part of? How is it different? How does it diverge? Or in some cases, like even in the exhibition, there's some question marks of like, okay, what game was this? Is it related? Is this a game of pegs moving around? Is it a different type of game? Like what pieces was it played with? Because everyone knows, like the pieces for a game, they can tend to get lost over time, even in the span of a few years of a child's life. But and so if it's many, many decades, then you might just end up with a board, right? And that makes the question of like, how do people use this, the anthropological question a little bit trickier.
Yeah, it's a lot of detective work, really, and there's I'm sure everybody could find that. And I love your focus on the rules, because, of course, if you're playing with your family, if or your extended family or whatever that is, you already have rules of how you get, after dinner we do this or whatever the things are, and you get in habits and things. And it's an amazing thing to try to say, oh, we have to write that down because somebody wants to play this in 100 years. Like that's just bizarre to think about for most people. Kind of like making an index of your journal.
Yeah, and if you're interested in this topic, there's a great paper by Linda Hughes studying games as they were played by girls, sort of like traditional games, called Beyond the Rules of the Game, Why Are Rui Rules Nice? Which I really recommend for sort of understanding like how those things get created locally.
Thank you for sharing this. Another question, maybe specifically for you and Naomi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the place of the study of game boards in the curriculum at the NYU Game Center, and how the study of game boards can inform maybe the making of contemporary, game boards, but also computer games, like more generic games.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we have over the years incorporated history in a lot of different ways in our curriculum. And I think just sort of looking back at how people solved design challenges of communicating how to play a game through the visual design of the game. Because in the collection, you can see a lot of games, I think especially forms of Parcheesi, that are beautiful decorative objects. And then you kind of contrast them and say, well, wait a second, not all of these are beautiful decorative objects. Some of them seem to be, well, either, sort of made like more rough and ready, like just like, let's get to playing quickly and not necessarily make it beautiful. And then some of them seem to really be thinking about how is this going to make it easier for somebody to play and remember how the game works. And that's actually something we emphasize a lot in the curriculum, like the game design education, and are often looking at examples from from past decades, maybe all the way back to the period that the exhibition covers. But yeah, and I totally also I'll throw it up in the chat because we happen to have one of our faculty in the chat, Jesse Fuchs, who does teach a lot of history of things like of card games and board games. And so like I'll also sort of leave it to Jesse to give his thoughts in chat on how and why do we incorporate the study of historical board games into teaching contemporary game design. Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot, Jesse.
Jesse actually has a question for you both. So my question is the roll and move game seems to be the sort of eyeball like evolutionary good move that gets independently invented again and again by separate culture, whereas other forms seem more contingent. Why do you think that is, and how do you think it affects or even muddles studying the history of the roll and move? It's a very specific question.
Yeah, so I guess the question, if I could rephrase it, is why does the roll and move game show up all over the place, right? And like, whereas other types of forms, like, I don't know, like the Monopoly form is so specific and like happens at this particular juncture.
Or like the 9 men's Morris, 3 men's Morris kind of.
Right. I guess
where there's no roll. There's no roll. It's just turn taking.
There's no rolling in that. Yeah, I don't know. I think my guess would be, and again, I think you'd have to sort of like really do scholarship on this to make sure, but my understanding from mostly from reading secondary sources is that the roll and move game like evolved very early, right? So or various versions of a move game and then sort of combined with a dice to make a roll and move game. And so it had the chance to spread, well, like all over the place. So it's really more of a question of scale of history. That form, is it really independently invented all over the place? Maybe it is, and I'm off about this, but my guess would be that it's not necessarily independent. Or at least the sort of moving along a track game is so early in the evolution and spread of board games that it could go all over the place easily. And then pairing that with a die, I think it's like, it's maybe like what you would call an unsurprising move rather than a necessarily a good move. But I'm a little prejudiced against roll and move games. Do you have thoughts on that, Mary?
Yeah, the H.J.R. Murray, right, who wrote the book, like History of Chess and History of Games Other Than Chess, and it was like this big, very cut and dried text of categorizing games all around the world. Really, that was 70 years ago. So we really need to revisit this. It can't be up to, it's not been a part of like a massive scholarly exchange. Yeah. And it's so culturally dependent. If you're in a museum in Germany, you are not looking at the world's systems of gameplay, right? So we're just at the beginning. So hopefully this talk gets people excited about picking a research direction and looking into stuff, because there's a lot of room to really understand and specialize in this area.
100%.
There's really good questions.
Yeah, we have so many good questions. There is one question to go back to your comments on the role of women in the making of games. So it's a question from one of your colleagues, if I understand, Sheila Pierce. I would love to hear you talk about the history of gender and feminism in games. For instance, a basketball board game from the early 19th centuries 1900, sorry, that kind of paralleled the rise of YMCA as a breeding ground for suffragettes through sports, etc.
Yeah, it's a big topic, right? Like, thank you, Celia. It's, as you know, it's a wonderfully big topic. I mean, certainly the whole Victorian, women who were teaching or playing games with their kids in this quote leisure time, or the nannies or whoever was taking care of this kind of middle class, upper middle class, existence when people had leisure time. Not everyone had it. And that women were making a lot of decisions about what to play and how to play, and were playing themselves, right? So there is a lot left out about women in this entire industry, and I'm just going to say if we're talking board games, I mean, we all know the problems with digital games and gender, but we still have a really terrible problem with the number of women game designers in board games. I think that it's kind of a dismal number of women in the field inventing games. So so I think we have early examples. We didn't go into like around the world with Nellie Bly, or these kind of models of women adventuring and kind of giving that narrative. I think that would speak to the suffragette kind of thing. But yeah, I think another question in the chat was, were there other women game designers at this time? And I have not run into any. That said, if there were some, we already know Lizzie McGee had a really, really big body of work. She had patents. Not everyone can afford to file a patent. Not everyone knows how to do that. So I think that there are just a lot of, let's just say, borrowed games by women game designers, so that we wouldn't know that it was actually designed by women. It might have been. And go ahead, jump in.
And I think, as Celia Pierce is pointing out that in chat, that Stratego, I think in the mid 20th century, right, and the Mansion of Happiness as one of those roll and move games, like women were involved in the design of those games. The where I would not be surprised at all to see the influence and design chops of women is in these folk made games, right, that are often being made at home as a handicraft for for kids in the family. Maybe as opposed to buying a mass-produced version of Monopoly, right? Like just make your own at home. And often those games are adapted or changed in some way. So, I think of it, there is this long history of women trying to like find cracks and ways to sort of exist as designers and make their influence felt. And a slowly rising number of women involved in game design and scholarship. But there is a distinction still to this day, I think, between being able to do that in the private sphere and the public sphere. Because, if you look at big community game events at streaming online or at esports or like fighting game community, it's still a challenging place to sort of exist as a woman, right? To sort of be exposed in the public sphere to, often like hostility or sexualization, like any number of things. And I think that's because there's still a persisting division of saying like, well, the public sphere is safe for men to be athletes or stars, or to be celebrities on stage, or to be part of like a rough and tumble competitive culture. And for women, it's still at least tacitly easier to exist in the private sphere. But that said, I think that the example that Celia pointed out about the basketball board game is interesting, because it's a way of taking that sport into the private sphere and saying like, look, we're going to create a space for you to imagine playing basketball, just as you might imagine being Nellie Bly and going around the world or doing some other kind of imaginary activity. And like, you're going to play basketball. and you get to sort of experience some, a simulated version of that on a board in the safety of home, where you're not going to be exposed to to like adult men censuring the audacity of you trying to do athletics, right? So I'm not surprised that created a crack, right? Where, it could, it makes the very idea of women in sports more possible by creating a rehearsal for it.
Yeah, rehearsing culture, enculturation, changing culture by game practices, this is all powerful stuff.